Let's come to Vision 12, and let's go back to ancient Egypt, to the ancient Egyptian love lyrics of about 4,000 years ago. And we need to remind ourselves that in 2000 BC, Egyptian civilization was reborn, and they call that now the New Kingdom. The old kingdom in Egypt goes back to 3000 BC. And in the old kingdom, the power was always with the ruler, the pharaoh. And the very first powerful person in Egypt was Menes, or sometimes known as Narmer. And he's the one who united all of the 28 nomes, the districts of Egypt, and the north and south, the upper and lower Egypt, together into one entity, one place. The Old Kingdom is based upon the pyramids. All of the wealth, all of the power was concentrated to give the Pharaoh not only power in this world and this life, but to give him, specifically him, rebirth eternally by having the pyramid cult make sure that he was instructed by the secret, sacred language of how to get through the gates of the netherworld and rise again with the sun, with Ra, in the morning. The New Kingdom in Egypt is a different phenomenon. They are less interested in pyramids. They still build monumental places, but the focus is no longer on the pyramid. The focus is on the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the book of the coming forth by day. And so in 2000 BC, the whole notion of being able to go forth takes precedence over the commandeering of power. And so you have, for the first time, a distinction between power and wisdom that takes its root. And not only in Egypt, but in all the places that Egypt touched at the time. And one of the biggest places that it touched was the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, where Lebanon is today and where northern Israel is today. Those Canaanite kingdom lands record for the first time in that region of the world what we would call wisdom literature. You get the prototypes of Job, the prototypes of Daniel, 2000 BC, in early Canaanite mythologies. But there they are, very early, they are figures of a ritual comportment that have a mythological character and are capable of a symbolic individuality, but it is like they're embedded in the literature. They're embedded in the mythology. If it's written down, it's just a recording of the mythology. And so it is the mythic character of these figures that is there in 2000 BC. 2,000 years later, around the time of 0 BC or 1 AD, the emphasis shifts from the character as a mythological stylization of a ritual comportment figure to transform so that now you have an individuality that achieves a conscious personage. And so 3000 BC, you have ritual figures. 2000 BC, you have mythic characters. And in between, you have the development of symbolic senses of individuality. And then about the time of the turn of the millennia, you have the emergence of the spiritual person who takes away the power of the powers. And so you have a completely radical revolution going on at that time. It is commandeered, as all new things are commandeered, by hangers-on, by the powers that be that refuse to give up their control and authority. And so you have a period of struggle for several hundreds of years, and then you have a commandeering of a great portion of it. And part of what is interesting is that in our time, we have enough material, we have enough archaeological discoveries, enough savvy about languages and literatures from all over the planet, that for the last 100 years increasingly, we have had a global view of what has happened and can now, at the beginning of the 21st century, reconstruct a great deal. One of the qualities in ancient Egyptian love poetry of 2000 BC surfaces 1,000 years later. Notice the movement by millennia. 1,000 years after the Egyptian New Kingdom, you have the wisdom of Solomon. And the wisdom of Solomon is embedded in the Song of Songs. And at the end of the Song of Songs, you have this mythological characterization with a symbol, and the symbol is that of the vineyard. The vineyard is where the grapes are grown to make the wine. King Solomon owned a vineyard located at Baal Hamon. He leased this vineyard to farmers, and each was to pay for its fruits 1,000 pieces of silver. You can have your 1,000, Solomon, and your farmers their 200. My vineyard I keep for myself. O you who dwell in the gardens, your companions listen to your voice. Let me hear it also, saying, and then you have something very rare. You have a man and a woman singing a quatrain that closes the Song of Songs together. And they sing, fly with me, O my beloved, and be like the roe or a fawn upon perfume-laden hills. And so they sing to each other. So that you have, in the Song of Songs, the Song of Solomon's, the first appearance of not just a symbolic individuality that has integrated itself from the mythic horizon, but you have the emergence of a pair of spiritual persons who together constitute a new form of man, a spiritual form that the two come together in an exchange way, create an alchemical whole being. That where there were two before, there's now one, in the sense of not being condensed to one individuality, but of being ratioed so that the oneness is 1 over 1. It is still one, but it's now a ratio between two ones that are brought together so that their unity now is a differential unity rather than just an integral unity. It's a monumental change. Because it means now that you can have proportions of wholeness that are themselves still whole, even though they are in ratioed proportionalities. And when one has ratioed proportionalities, you have a sense of unity that it's not just like a target going to the center, but you have resonances that fill out a set that makes a harmonic. And so the natural way to express this is to shift from prose to poetry, from mythic language or the symbolic written form of mythic language to a sung musical, poetic 1,000 years after Solomon, you get something like this, the Odes of Solomon, written about 40 A.D. This is Ode 23 out of 42. This is just the beginning. Joy is for the holy ones, and who shall put it on but they alone? Grace is for the elect ones, and who shall receive it but they who trusted in it from the beginning? Love is for the elect ones, and who shall put it on but they who possessed it from the beginning? Walk in the knowledge of the Lord, and you will know the grace of the Lord generously, both for his exaltation and for the perfection of his knowledge. It's quite possible that these Odes of Solomon were written by Mary Magdalene and wrote it of her relationship, not a relationship to a Christ figure that is a symbol out of the mythic horizon, but a Jesus who is a person, a spiritual person, who is now in the differential conscious horizon, who emerges out of vision into the spiritual art form of the person, but does not emerge alone, but emerges paired. And so one gets, for the very first time, about the middle of the 1st century AD, the 1st century of the Common Era, you get the realization that there is such a thing as a tunable human spiritual unity of two that come into their ratioed proportionality together, and that the two of them together constitute a mysterious center. It took 1,500 years for someone to figure out the mathematics of how that works and how that happens. And the person who figured it out was named Kepler. And Kepler was the one who figured out that the orbit of Mars around the sun could never be a perfect circle. That the orbit of Mars mathematically, from all of the careful observations made over dozens and dozens of years by his master, Tycho Brahe, in Denmark, in a little island off the coast of Denmark, where he set up a utopian observational community called Uraniborg. And Kepler was the mathematical genius that Tycho brought in to do the math for him, because he was a good observer, but Kepler was the best mathematician of the time. He was the best mathematician in the world until Sir Isaac Newton, later, almost 100 years later. Kepler was the first to realize that the orbit of Mars is an ellipse, because it is not that Mars goes around the sun so much, but that Mars and the sun together go around a common center. In math, we call it a barycenter. There is nothing there, but is the gravitational focus of the two bodies working together. And so the center of our star system, or any star system, is not the star, but the relationship between the star and its planets moving around a common gravitational focus, a pivot of energies and of gravities. But at the time of the turn of 2,000 years ago, that millennium, it was meditatively, contemplatively, in deep prayer, fully realized that the perfection is not that there should be an integral that exists in an existential way necessarily, or even in a mental way necessarily, but that there be a pivot which is the center of a shared presence, movement. And this takes away power from power, because power is no longer just in power, but power now is in the refined realization that the true center is shared between us, And that what is there is the shared pivot, and it doesn't have to be existentially objective. It doesn't have to be mentally registrable. It can be mysteriously determined by a cooperative ballet, and that the minimum for that are two people who are able to have the secret exchange of selves so that they begin to occupy this ratioed 1/1 wholeness. This is very, very profound. And when it first appeared, it seemed like magic. In fact, it was considered a magical operation. And the first person who knew this was the greatest magician of the day. His name was Simon Magus. His very name, Simon Magus, means Simon the magician. And Simon Magus lived in Samaria, in between Galilee and Judea. And when he heard that there was this possibility, he had everything going for him. He was not only the greatest magician of the day, but he understood that there was something esoteric in here between two people, between a man and a woman. And his consort was named Helen. She was an ex-prostitute. And she was a part of his show where he would go from place to place and perform magical things. And he was famous in his day, the most famous man. He was the original transform of what was a proto-Gnosticism into Gnosticism. So he offered to buy the secret from two of the disciples of Jesus, from Peter and from John. He said, "How much do you want for the secret? I have plenty of money. Make arrangements. You name your price, I'll meet it." The story of that is in the New Testament, in the Acts of the Apostles, which is the sequel to the Gospel according to Luke, written down just about the end of the 60s AD. What is troublesome about Luke, and especially the Acts of the Apostles as the follow-up to the Gospel of Luke, is its concern, its over-concern with the demonic and the magical. Susan Garrett has written one of the best studies of it called The Demise of the Devil, Magic and the Demonic in Luke's Writings. And she goes into it in a wonderfully quiet way. It's published by a biblical publishing house, Fortress Press in Minneapolis. Very old, used to be in Philadelphia. She says that time and time again, the difficulty was to make sure that miracles were not magic. Whereas in the mythic horizon, miracles are magical. There's no distinction between them. And so the whole quality was to make sure that the miracles are a proof of spiritual power. Now, how would they be spiritual power? Not because the magician himself had the power, but because the miracle worker cooperated with someone else, whoever was receiving the miraculous power, cooperated with them. So they two together made it spiritually miraculous rather than mythically magical. There's a huge difference. But the difficulty is that someone carrying this capacity can lose track of the fact that they do not have the power, but they have the ability to cooperate together and have a spiritual miraculousness. The first person to misunderstand that was St. Peter. And the very first person that he misunderstood it about was Mary Magdalene. It is a peculiar thing, and it was lost for almost 1600 years. But when it was found again, the Gospel according to Thomas makes it very clear what's going on here. Now, it's quite interesting because the Gospel according to Thomas is one of the Nag Hammadi manuscripts, one of the Gnostic treasure trove of manuscripts that was buried along the Nile River, and because they were under proscription that if you owned these kinds of texts, you would be killed. Not killed by the Romans, but killed by the Roman Christian authorities who had taken over the Roman Empire. So anything like this was heretical. So they were buried so that people wouldn't be killed. And all the other copies that one would know about were all destroyed. What's curious about the Gospel of Thomas is the almost miraculous way in which it was rediscovered. Because the Nag Hammadi find in 1945 just confirmed what it was, the actual original discovery of a couple of leaves, a couple of pages of the Gospel of Thomas was in 1897, the same year the electron was discovered. Two British archaeologists found an ancient scrap heap of shards of papyrus pages and leaves and scrolls. And the first thing they pulled out of this stack were what became later recognized as a couple of pages, a couple of fragments of the Gospel of Thomas. But they ran out of money, so they couldn't pursue it for a couple of years. And in 1903, they came back 6 years later. They went back to the heap. And unbelievably, the first things that they pulled out of the heap in 1903 were 2 or 3 more pages of the Gospel of Thomas, if you can believe this. But no one knew what it was. They were simply called fragments of an unknown gospel until the entire Thomas was found in Nag Hammadi in 1945. But it wasn't until 1959 that there was an English translation made by half a dozen of the world's greatest scholars at the time, and this is how the Gospel of Thomas ends. His disciples said to him, "When will the kingdom come?" Jesus said, "It will not come by expectation." They will not say, "See here," or "See there," but the kingdom of the Father is spread upon the earth, and men do not see it. Simon Peter said to them, "Let Mary go out from among us, because women are not worthy of the life." Jesus said, "See, I will lead her, so that I will make her male, that she too may become a living spirit." In Greek it's pneuma. "Resembling you males, for every woman who makes herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven." This is a very peculiar saying. Nowhere else in the world do you find this except in one of the most famous figures in Asian wisdom. Is the only place in the world that you find this other than in the Gospel according to Thomas. And the figure in Asian spirituality, who is this, is Kuan Yin. And Kuan Yin is originally male, masculine, but becomes progressively, almost like inevitably, the archetypal female spirit helper. In ancient times, she had 2 names. The first name is the one that carries over most famously because in Tibetan Buddhism, it is the most outstanding spiritual personage there. In Sanskrit, the name is Avalokiteshvara. Ishvara by itself is like a spirit person that comes even out of the Upanishadic levels. The Isha Upanishad, Ishvara is a name for Krishna. But Avalokiteshvara can be said in a couple of different ways so that the syllables are given a little bit of a different emphasis by the pace in which one pronounces it. And Avalokiteshvara, Shvara means, in Chinese it's translated as yin, and Avalokita is translated as Quan. So you get Quan Yin. What those words mean, in pronounced that way, is precise sound. It means that whoever has ears to hear can hear this. What is the sound? The sound is the sound of the real world. That if someone calls out in a real spiritual way, Avalokiteshvara is the Bodhisattva of mercy who will always hear you and always respond. And in responding with you, you will be in one of these berry centers with the Bodhisattva of infinite mercy. You will be restored back. The figure who embodies the Bodhisattva of Avalokiteshvara is the Dalai Lama. Because the Dalai Lama must hold that particular spiritual quality which has its complement that makes an invisible pivot. This is a lecture on vision, folks, not theology. The Dalai Lama is always, as Avalokiteshvara, linked to another incarnation, another embodiment. The original Panchen Lama is the incarnate figure of the Amida Buddha, Amitabha Buddha. The Amitabha Buddha is not the historical Buddha. The Amitabha Buddha is a development of a different Buddha that came 500 years after the historical Buddha, was the Buddha of the glorified body. And the Buddha of the glorified body, after several hundreds of years of refinement, became the Amitabha Buddha, who is the Buddha in the Western paradise, that when you die, you do not die, but you go to the Western paradise where you're saved. And the earliest woodblock scroll print in the world is of the Western paradise of the Amitabha Buddha that goes back to about the 800s AD in China and Tibet. I have a copy of it, and I will bring it next week to let you see. What you see in it is that all the figures in the Western paradise are studying. They are all learning. And they are all busy learning, not just reading, but talking, singing together. And the whole coterie of thousands of these figures also make up the head gestalt of the Amitabha Buddha. And where the mouth of the Amitabha Buddha gestalt head would be, there's an open space, because that Buddha's mouth is open because he is speaking a word. And in that word is the only figure whose back is to the viewer of the manuscript, of the mandala. And that figure is in deep contemplative prayer. And their deep contemplative prayer penetrates into the salvation wind of the word of the Amitabha Buddha. All of this goes back to another figure, not only of Avalokiteshvara, but the earliest registry of the feminine form of Avalokiteshvara, of Kuan Yin, is the Lady Prajnaparamita, the Lady of the Perfection of Wisdom. And she first surfaces in the very first century AD, around 100 AD. And she comes and emerges out of a revolution in Buddhism at that time. The revolution was made by a man, the most famous holy person in that whole region of the world at that time. His name was Ashvaghosha. Asva is the Asva is the horse. Ashvaghosha literally means the horse's neighing, the voice of the horse. Somebody who is very, very strong in their poetic and in their integrity. Boris Pasternak in Russia is often referred to as the eye of the horse, the man who would not flinch at the threat of the powers of Stalin and so forth. The integrity of someone who is profoundly there. But in Asian wisdom, it goes back to the Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad, because in the largest, Brihad means great breath. Aranyaka means forest ascetic. Upanishad means sit at the feet of. So the Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad is what one would have heard in the deep forest ashram of the great breath teaching of the ultimate sage. And the very first thing that's there is the simile that one has to learn to meditate on the entirety of the world as if the sun was the eye of a horse and the wind-swept clouds the mane, and that one rides then the world horse to complete freedom in one's meditation. The perfection of wisdom sutra is the earliest sutra after Ashvaghosha's particular little sutra. And it begins with this. Subhuti asks the Buddha, not the historical Buddha, but this is a conversation that happens in the glorified resonant harmonic of the historical Buddha and his most subtle disciple named Subhuti. Subhuti says the great vehicle is called a great vehicle. Why? Surpassing the world with its gods and men and asuras, demons. That vehicle will go forth. Notice the going forth resurfaces powerfully. Not just the going forth by day, but the going forth by eternity. It's gained enormous amplitude by this time. It is like space. As in space, so is this vehicle. There is room for countless beings. In this way, it is a great vehicle of the bodhisattvas, the great beings. Just as one can see no coming or going or abiding of space, so one cannot get at the coming, going, or abiding of this great vehicle. You can't do it objectively, either in body or in mind, because it is transcendent of the integral. It is in a differential unity, which means that it works by prismatics and not by pragmatics. It's not something that you do that makes it happen. It's not something that you think that brings it together. It is what you are consciously in the spiritual form of your person that sends out the resonances that are met. So that you get the sending out of your resonances in a spiritual way, and they are met by spiritual resonances that come together, and when two waveforms come together, they produce a density wave. And they weave together a transcendental realm that is more real than existence, more real than the mind. And so the perfection of wisdom, the Prajnaparamita Sutra says, just as one cannot get at the beginning of space, or its end, or its middle, on the count of the sameness of the three periods of time, Why are they the same? Because they're in a nature mysterious flow. There's no such thing as past, present, and future. There's only the flow of timelessness that has not come into the forms of objective existence where there is a beginning, middle, and an end, a past, a present, and a future. They are all together in a ribbon without end, and that ribbon is a dynamic, which is time in its timelessness process before it becomes formed. The going forth is held to be the highest quality, that one goes forth into this kind of conscious dimensional time-space, where it is not only timelessness and infinite space, but has the further dimension of spiritual consciousness, so it's like a 5-dimensional conscious time-space. It has a whole different set of properties, of activities, so that the spirit form of the artist in bringing this to pass, this transformation, is now, from the mythic standpoint, a magical being, but from the art standpoint, is an artist in creative imagination. That what they create in their art, their spiritual art, becomes more real than just ritual existential things or mental symbolic things, and thus steals away power from power and delivers it into a cooperative density wave of spiritual cooperation. Prometheus, in Prometheus Bound of Aeschylus, 2,500 years ago, is led by power, who is always speaking in authority against Prometheus, and violence, who never says anything, and power and violence lead him with the blacksmith of the gods, Hephaestus, who's to chain him to mountain exile forever because Prometheus has stolen the refining fire of Hephaestus's creativeness out of mythology and delivered it to man, where man will find it when he is transcendentally, spiritually mature. He will find he has that creative fire, the imagination that can bring spiritual forms into being. Zeus does not like this because his power is on the mythic level, and only as long as human beings remain locked into the mythos does he still have his authority. If they are able to transcend the world of gods and demons and angels and all these other mythological figures, then they will come into a quintessential conscious space-time where they will discover that together they can make a new form of community. And when they do, the old saying is, in a song by Chuck Berry, roll over, Beethoven, tell Tchaikovsky the news. They're rocking in 2 by 2. The new Noah. Let's take a break. Let's come back to the perfection of wisdom, which is a differential. The forms that come out of differential consciousness are like prisms. They're like lenses. They can focus, but they can change their focus so they have multiple focuses. And all of the multiplicity of the focuses are able to be calibrated by the lens. So if you have a special kind of a lens, which is called a jewel, and the archetypal jewel is the diamond, you get a kind of a wisdom sutra that's called the Diamond Cutter Sutra, the Vajrachedika. The Diamond Cutter Sutra is a condensation into 300 lines of the Prajnaparamita Sutra, which originally was 8,000 lines. And later, because they got into the gorgeousness of it, the first word to be used was splendor. Because of the splendor, the original Prajnaparamita Sutra got enlarged from 8,000 to 18,000 lines to 25,000 lines, finally to the Mahaprajnaparamita Sutra, 100,000 lines. But they also went the other way of condensing it, and one of the condensations was to 300 lines, which was the Diamond Cutter Sutra. Then they condensed it to 25 lines, which became the Heart Sutra, the Hridaya Sutra. Then they condensed it to one syllable, Ah. And there is a sutra, the Ah Sutra. And what it was showing was that this is a movable feast. It's a movable focus. You can expand it or you can contract it, and its scalar maintains its reality all the way from a single syllable to 100,000 lines. Never loses its ability to focus, but your ability then shifts, because at 8,000 lines, it's at the place where, like the human eye, can see visible light. But that visible light is a registry in the electromagnetic spectrum. And that all of these other sizes of the Prajnaparamita Sutra are extending from visible light into all of the other electromagnetic registries, from infrared to ultraviolet. The interpenetration of East and West is colossal at this time. One of the most deepest registries of it is the way in which alchemy spread back and forth between China and Egypt in that time period. And it's fully indexed in about 20 volumes by Joseph Needham, Cambridge University Press, Science and Civilization in China. And several of the early volumes show how it goes back and forth, and that's why you have alchemy in China and in Greco-Egypt. Very similar. The very first time that you get a sense that Buddhism, classical Buddhism, has undergone a transformation out of its mythological level, beyond its symbolic integral, is about 90 AD. And Ashvaghosha wrote a book which has been in reverence ever since. The Shraddhapada Sutra is, in English translation, the awakening of faith in the Mahayana. There is nothing in classical Buddhism about faith. It is a technique, it is a methodology of getting rid of the illusions. So the awakening of faith in the Mahayana is obviously something beyond where the methodology of historical Buddhism went. It goes into the prismatic, jeweled resonances of spiritual beings, spiritual persons, and they have an affinity not just with existence in life, and not just with the mind in one's experience, but they have their own personal acquaintanceship in consciousness, but they look forward to another reverberation of personal consciousness, and that is the cosmos itself is a form of hyperconsciousness. The cosmos is alert, knows our spirit person like one knows someone, and is able to work with them in very large barycenters. And so one finds Right after Ashvaghosha, around 100 AD, Ashvaghosha was commandeered by the most powerful emperor of the day. His name was Kanishka. And Kanishka's kingdom was most of Central Asia and northern India. And he took his armies and laid siege to a city simply to get Ashvaghosha as his price for withdrawing the siege. Not to capture him, but to take him back so that his Central Asian kingdom could be great like Ashoka's India had been great with the historical Buddha. Kanishka took Ashvaghosha back into Central Asia about 90 AD, and Kanishka died about 117 AD, and after that one had this proliferation of the Mahayana as an awakening of faith in the Lady Prajnaparamita being able to teach us how to be spiritual persons and relate to the cosmos. Whole different range. And the first sutra that comes out of that is the Abhisamaya. The Abhisamaya, it means beyond the realm of not just the samsara of illusion, but of the ordinary integral of samadhi. A beyond samadhi. And one of the reverberations that came out of this, out of the Abhisamaya, was because it was so new and so subtle, even arcane, that it was given a commentary to go with it. And the commentary is called a Lamkara. And so the Abhisamaya Lamkara is one of the earliest documents in the Mahayana. And in the Abhisamaya Lamkara, one has for the very first time a happening that never happened in any other Buddhist sutra. The Buddha smiles. And this is how it reads. There was a woman who had come to that assembly of all the monks, all the men. There's a woman who came to that assembly and sat down. Then she rose from her seat, adjusted her top robe over one shoulder, knelt to the earth on her right knee, folded her hands towards the Lord Buddha, and said to him, Lord Buddha, in this place, I am not frightened. I am not terrified, not trembling, not frightened, and not terrified. I will show the teachings to all sentient beings. Then the Lord Buddha broke out into a smile, golden in color. On that occasion, by its luster, it beamed through endless and boundless world systems, rising up as far as Brahma's world. Then, after it returned, it circled around the Lord Buddha 3 times and then finally faded from his face. Immediately after the Lord Buddha had broken into that smile, the woman seized some golden flowers, strewing and scattering the golden flowers over the Lord Buddha. But then those golden flowers, unsupported, were suspended in the air. Zero gravity. Then the Venerable Ananda rose from his seat, adjusted his top robe over one shoulder, knelt to the earth on his right knee, folded hands towards the Lord Buddha, and said to him, What prompted that, Lord Buddha? What was the reason you broke into a smile? Truly perfected, enlightened Tathagatas and Arhats do not break into a smile without cause or good reason. And the Lord Buddha replied to the Venerable Ananda, was his cousin, very wise. Ananda, this is our sister, the goddess of the Ganges. She will arise as an arhat, truly, perfectly enlightened, accomplished in knowledge and good conduct, a Sugata, a streetwise, supreme tamer of wild men, a teacher of both gods and men, a Buddha, a Lord Buddha. She will become completely enlightened, truly perfect in the coming stellar aeon. That was written about 100 AD, about the time that St. John wrote the book of Revelation, the Apocalypse, but the time that the first Hermetic treatises, the Poimandres, was written. The world received everywhere, like in a harmonic vibration at that time, a perfection of wisdom that was almost too pristine for belief, and so one had to suspend belief because it was cosmically splendor, and one had to go on the faith that you would in time get used to these new dimensions, 5-dimensional spread. And so one of the first Chinese sutras where Kuan Yin is mentioned for the very first time is from 185 AD, and it's called the Perfect Splendor Samadhi Sutra. And that's the first time Kuan Yin is mentioned. That she carries, like the Lady Prajna Paramita carries, Kuan Yin carries, whereas the Lady Prajna Paramita teaches one how to learn. The Kuan Yin figure, the Avalokiteshvara, makes sure that even if you haven't learned, you can cooperate in mercy and be saved. You can do it either way. And both of them work together. The diamond in Sanskrit is called Vajra. Vajra Chadika means diamond cutter. And so out of this eventually developed a new refinement, a distillation of the Mahayana called the Vajrayana. Yeah. And in the Vajrayana, the diamond vehicle, it's that one can find in the cooperative exchange between two people the seed of one's spiritual person on a cosmic expandable scalar. And so instead of calling them sutras, sutra in Sanskrit means thread. It means being able to follow the thread all the way through so one understands it integrally. The new form was the tantras. The tantras are the cooperativeness of two beings together to make a barycenter, not between them, but with them as a set, as a tuning fork set. And that if you have sets of these sets arranged, it's like having tuning forks that make then a larger harmonic set so that one then can tune everything to the music of reality, including the cosmos. One of the things that we're using, along with Shakespeare's Tempest, is Shelley's Prometheus Unbound, because these two works give us a visionary traction of a very deep pair. One, The Tempest, is about a magician in a play about magic who gives up the magic so that two lovers can be together in their own miraculous way and not be subject to his magic. And so he gives up his magic in the play, and then he addresses the audience in an epilogue and says, I have given up my magic as a playwright as well, but you must release me because you are now with me making the barycenter of this extra drama, which isn't on the stage but is now in the theater. Release me as I have released my players on the stage. Release me from this theater so that I can go out into the world like you do and just be free. When Shelley came, he was not yet 30 years old. And we talked about this, of how he and his wife and Lord Byron and a number of very, very high-powered spirits came together in Lake Geneva in Switzerland. And Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, Frankenstein, the modern Prometheus. Immediately that it was published in the original edition in 1818, Shelley got to work on Prometheus Unbound. Because he knew Greek well enough, he made his own translations of Plato and of Aeschylus. It is very difficult to translate Aeschylus's Greek. It's very refined. The only other person I ever heard of who could translate Aeschylus's Greek when they were still an adolescent was Henry David Thoreau. When Thoreau went to Harvard as an older teenager, he made his own translation of Aeschylus, and that translation is in the Huntington Library here in Los Angeles, in San Marino. And you read Thoreau's translation of Aeschylus, you realize how brilliant he was. Emerson knew how to give good Unitarian sermons. Thoreau was a cosmic genius, like Shelley. But the version of Frankenstein that one usually finds is the 1831 version that Mary Shelley revised. After Shelley had died in 1822, 9 years later, she brought out a whole different version of Frankenstein. The 1818 Frankenstein has the monster on the cover. The 1831 has a kind of like a alchemical figure on the cover. It's not a modern Prometheus so much as it is a misshapen, bad magic being that has come in to play. In the original Frankenstein, Frankenstein is the Superman. It's only that he is a flawed Superman. But in the 1831, it's like this is a monster, like in the characterization of Frankenstein as a mythic figure. And it's the 1831 Frankenstein that has influenced everyone, except it was the 1818 Frankenstein that influenced Shelley at the end of his life, what it turned out to be. He drowned in a storm in a sailboat off the coast of Italy, Leghorn. And his body wasn't found until about a week later. And because Mary was such a classic, great woman, she held a funeral on the beach and had his body burned so that it would not be in its corrosive quality after a week of being bloated in the ocean, that would not be committed to the earth. But she had a Viking-type bonfire on the beach for him. And hardly ever recovered. Shelley's Prometheus, Unbound, takes Aeschylus's binding and releases him, because in Aeschylus, Prometheus is a titan. He's not regular human. His father is Father Sky, and his mother is Mother Earth. The Titans are beings who belong in sky and earth together. They're very huge as beings. Whereas Zeus is a mythological figure who can only survive as long as the mythological air is all that there is. As soon as a different kind of space comes in, not the air of the earth, but the space beyond the earth, the space in between the stars, in between the galaxies. Spirit beings can breathe in that. They can breathe space, pure space. They don't need air. So Zeus wants to keep man where he breathes only mythological air. Otherwise, they're not going to worship him. And the key to not worshiping him is that Prometheus has stolen the sacred spark of creative fire from Hephaestus and has given it to man. And that when man discovers how to use the secret, sacred, refining fire, he will then master the alchemy of transforming not only things in the world, but himself as well. So that the transformed person now is freed from the power of mythological figures permanently. He can still tell their stories and appreciate them, but he appreciates them as literary stories, not as defining characteristics. He transforms from being a part of the story to the capacity to be the storyteller and can create original stories that were never in the tribes. And so Shelley's whole theory of poetry that's manifest in Prometheus Unbound is that man frees himself because he learns to use a language that resonates with the cosmos. And that when the cosmos recognizes that it's being sung to, it sings back to man in such a way that the artist now gains a new quality. They're not only able to make artistic forms, but they're able to make forms of science as well. And science is a resonance of art. Whereas the mythological defense, so that man does not develop science, is to say, well, no. Science is opposed to art. The scientists and the artists are at war with each other, which is a lie. They're not. The arts and sciences are always together. And since the Renaissance, they've been together. All over the world, universities have departments of arts and sciences. They always go together. But it's in the later Renaissance that one finds the attempt at a counter-Renaissance to put an end to that by discrediting those who would transform as being black magicians. Yeah. And the first person to be discredited was John Dee. John Dee was Queen Elizabeth's astrologer and the greatest mathematician of his day. His first great work was to figure out the mathematics of how you navigate on the open oceans of the world, so you don't have to follow the shore and go the long way around to places. You can go across the oceans. And John Dee is the first to figure out the math and the instruments so that one can sail across open oceans. So that for the first time, one had the ability to navigate the entire globe. And as soon as that ability to understand that man was now free to navigate the entire globe, Shakespeare and his friends tore down the old theater that was on one side of the Thames, barged the timbers across the Thames to Bankside on the other side, and built a new theater called the Globe. And over the stage in the Globe, for the first time, one had the entire zodiac, like a halo, saying that what happens on this stage is just a pivot in the entire world. And Shakespeare's famous forever for one of his great lines, the entire world's a stage. And on the stage of the world, man is now free to act in his own spiritual person. We live in a time where the whole star system is our stage. We're going to transcend this planet. We already are. Very quickly, very far. And when the star system is the pivot, what you look out on are the interstellar adventures, stars without end. This was the record of all of the angel magic language that John Dee was involved in, supposedly in a black magician way, that was discredited by a man and his son, and their names were Casaubon, and the father's name was Isaac Casaubon. And he was the one who said the Hermetic writings are not ancient. They have too many affinities with Christianity, so they must be later than Christianity. They must be forgeries trying to imitate Christianity. And then his son, Merrick, is the one that discredited John Dee, saying, well, all of alchemy is part of this Hermetic phoniness. And so one had then the end of this whole quality of transform that had come in the Renaissance with the discovery of the Hermetic treatises, the translation of Plato by Ficino. And so you have books like Spiritual and Demonic Magic from Ficino to Campanella, who lived later on in the 1500s and wrote a utopia called City of the Sun. By the early 1600s, the force that was coming in to repress all of this is all black magic. We need to purify ourselves. And you find the rise and empowerment of the Puritans. And the Puritans did not want to purify themselves simply by living good lives now. They wanted to emulate the ancient lives of the original Christians. We're going to live like they did. We're going to go back and we're just going to live within that. It's like in 90 AD at the Council of Jamnia. All the Jewish teachers called rabbis got together and said, we're not going to go into this gorgeous splendor, cosmic person, who knows what. We're going to go back to the old Torah and we're going to make a text that will never be changed. And so they established what is called the Masoretic text of the Jewish Bible. And if you buy a Masoretic text in 2005, it is exactly to every iota what it was in 90 AD. But of course, human beings are always into interpretations, and so there are all kinds of interpretive things. And so a lot of rabbinic learning is about all the different interpretations that can be about this one thing. And so you get a code of laws that can never be changed, and interpretations without end that never come to a conclusion. And so one is involved in indefinite negotiation about what it means. There's no perfection of wisdom. There's only the honing of the ability to argue your case on the basis of precedents. And so one gets into a scrambled kind of historical situation that is very rarely challenged on the level of a Shakespeare or a Shelley. Really challenged. In our time, this education brings that challenge to the entire planet and all of its history. Not with an eye to the past or just the present, but in that flow, that is the future that we can inhabit, not in just interpretations, but in varieties, in possibilities without end. Next week we bring an interval in. The intervals are to give us articulation. I'm old enough to remember that I learned as a junior high school student how to set type with the fonts and all the little lead letters. And when you would hold a little metal bar and you would set your type, and when you got several paragraphs, then you could put those into a larger thing, and then you could eventually, when you filled that, you would print the page off that. One of the biggest boxes in setting type are little blank pieces of lead that go in between the words. Our intervals in between the phases. And we're going to take one of the most profound interpenetration density waves of all time. When the Hellenistic Jewish proto-Christianity, Mahayana, came into the Taoist Chinese tradition, they met like two very mysterious waves. And it took a while. It took almost 400 years for it to come to a density wave that had enough definition so that some person would emerge and would blend the two together perfectly, weave the two together. And his name is Huineng. And Huineng is the developer of Zen Buddhism. He's the sixth patriarch in China. And the 28 eighth patriarch from Ashvaghosha that leads to the development of Zen. So next week we're going to take a look at one of the most incredible figures of all time. Huineg was such a master of control of his body and meditation that when he died, he transformed his physical body, bones and flesh, into a consistency that's like anthracite coal. So the body of Huineg still exists, petrified as like anthracite coal from when he died 1,300 years ago. Joseph Needham, the author of Science and Civilization in China, the master of Gonville and Caius College, Cambridge, took a photo of Huineg, of his petrified body. Joseph Needham was a professor of science, of endocrinology, of biology at Cambridge before he got involved. He took the photo so that he could pinch himself and let others know. All of this is true. And we'll look at it next week.